it all starts. Well, you might say to me, well, what about creation and Noah and the Tower of Babel and so on? Yes, all of that, of course, is correct. But the story of Abram, who becomes Abraham, and Sarai, his wife, who becomes Sarah, leads to the creation of the people of Israel. And that is the nation that Jesus is born into, and that leads us to being joined into the family of Christians. So this is literally the beginning of that story. So without further ado, Genesis chapter 12 and the first 9 verses. Yahweh said to Abram, "Get yourself from your country, from your homeland and from your father's household, to the country that I shall enable you to see. And I shall make you into a big nation. I shall bless you and make your name big, and you'll become a blessing. I shall bless the people who curse you, and the person who slights you I shall curse. All the kin groups on the earth will bless themselves by you." Abram went as Yahweh spoke to him, and Lot went with him. Abram was a man of 75 years when he left Haran. So Abram took Sarai his wife, Lot his brother's son, all the property they had acquired, and all the people that they produced in Haran, and left to go to the country of Canaan. When they came to the country of Canaan, Abram passed through the country as far as the site of Shechem, as far as Morah Oak. The Canaanites were then in the country. Yahweh appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I shall give this country." He built an altar there for Yahweh who had appeared to him. He went on from there to the mountain country on the east of Bethel and spread his tent. Bethel on the west, the ruin on the east. He built an altar there for Yahweh and called in Yahweh's name. Abram moving on gradually to the Negev. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In the chapter before this, we have Abram's father, Terah, taking his son and his grandson Lot, so Abraham's brother Lot's father had died, from to Haran. Now that's a pretty long journey for the whole family. Let me just show you on the map if I can. So is down here, Haran is there, this is the Mediterranean, this is Canaan, and the Negev is sort of down here. So is near the mouth of the river Euphrates on the Persian Gulf, and we don't know why Terah left. We're not even told that Terah had a relationship with God. What changes at Haran is that Abram is clearly called by God to go and to leave country and home and to follow God. Abram will never go back, though he will send for a wife for his son Isaac from Haran. Canaan is to be the base where Abram is to live. Why there? Well, it's a crossing point for east and west, north and south trading routes. So you might say this is putting Abram at the centre of the known world, where everything's happening or will happen. And God says he will make Abram a great nation. There are human problems with that. Sarai was not young. Certainly she was beyond normal childbearing age. Abram himself was 75, so how's all this going to happen? And in addition, of course, there are other people living in that land. How also will Abram become a blessing to others? And yet God has, of course, surely made the name of Abraham become great. There are few better known people in world history, known to Israelis, to Muslims, to Christians. Paul calls him the father of all believers. And just a quick word about ages in the Old Testament. We may decide that they're just round numbers selected to show importance. Or we may conclude, as some scientists have done, that people may have lived much longer lives then because their diet was so good at the time. The important point is that Abraham was not a young man. It's also worth noting that blessing has been a feature of Genesis. God blesses the animals and the Sabbath and Noah and his sons. But here, God not only blesses Abram, but also makes him a blessing to others. And why Abram? Well, we don't know, except that Paul says in Romans, God made promises to Abram before Abraham did anything to merit God's approval. Abraham was not always faithful, but what he did was to believe what God said to him. And that was so important. Abraham sets out to the land I will show you with his whole family, including his nephew Lot, and with all his possessions. What an amazing thing to do. Can you imagine loading everything up and taking your whole family on foot to a totally new country because God will bless you? Abraham is to be a blessing to the world, and the author of Genesis doesn't know about that, of course, but he or she does know that Abraham was an incalculable blessing to Israel. But it's also true that sometimes Abraham is a direct means of blessing, as we find elsewhere in Genesis when he prays, for example, for kings. In addition, Abraham is to become the kind of person that people will see as an embodiment of blessing. And then Abram arrives in Canaan at Shechem, nowadays Nablus, on the west bank, an abbreviation of New City founded by the Romans after the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. So why Shechem? Well, because it had a good water supply, it was surrounded by good farming land, and it was on a major road crossing from the Mediterranean to the Jordan Valley. It's also, incidentally, where Jacob's well is to be found, where Jesus meets the Samaritan woman in the Gospels. One way to think of it is a large unwalled village with a famous large tree, the oak of Morah. Abram and Sarai give up a large part of their life to move, but they also take much with them, not just Abram's nephew Lot, but servants and members of the extended family. There must have been hundreds of them, because by chapter 14, Abram has 318 trained men for battles with him. So obviously many of them would have had wives, there would have been children, there would have been parents, and so on. And what do they do when they get there? Well, I guess like many of us in new surroundings, even just on holiday, they explored the whole area to see what it was like. They went from Shechem in the north to Bethel in the centre, and then to the south, going towards the Negev desert. It was a sort of beating of the bounds or staking out the country, depending on how you look at it. And notice that at some point, this town dweller has become a tent dweller, mainly because of its flexibility, but also because the villages, of course, were fully occupied. And notice that God appears to Abram for the first time. We don't know what that was like, but the word appears suggests that this was more than a vision, but more like a human who was obviously God. It's as if God is saying, welcome to your new home. Abram in response builds an altar at Shechem and then another at Bethel. They are not stopping at any of these places, but they need a place when they return to make offerings every time they get there. Places where they could reach out in worship and prayer and self-giving. So what have we learnt from the beginnings of this amazing story, and how does this relate to us? Well, first we have an example of Abram being willing to uproot himself and his family on what looks like, to human eyes, a forlorn hope. And sometimes God does lead us to places or to do things which humanly look impossible or fruitless. However, we can trust him, and he will lead us, as he did Abram. And second, the first thing that Abram does is to worship. And I wonder how yours and my priorities are. What do we do first? What has the best of us? Whether that's early in the morning or later in the day, whenever is right for you. God has a call on when we are at our best. So more tomorrow as we continue